Hello and welcome to Research Methods. This is your first recorded or pre-recorded lecture, and you'll be listening to this the very first week of class. And I'm so excited really to teach you about research methods. I think it's a very fun and enjoyable class, but that's also, you have to take into account that I'm kind of a research nerd. So, that might have affected the way I feel about it. But wouldn't you rather have someone who's interested in research methods teach you about it instead of somebody who kind of hates it? So I kind of love it. Anyway, so welcome to Research Methods. Here, let's do that this way, sorry. Okay, slideshow, yep, that's it. Here we are. Okay, now we're starting officially. This is now the start, now that I'm doing it right. Yeah? Okay. So, week 1, recorded lecture, pre-recorded lecture. Let's talk about empiricism and ideas, measures, and operational definitions. So, what is empiricism? Well, there's a little bit about it in your book in chapter 1. And chapter 1 talks about various approaches to having knowledge. So we think of those as epistemologies. And epistemology is a how you know, the study of how you know, epistemology. And so empiricism is one way of knowing something. And it's knowing something through observation, through experience, through seeing it, through noticing it. And so this is kind of an interesting idea here. And there have been a lot of philosophers throughout history that have discussed empiricism, whether or not they called it empiricism. They've discussed empiricism versus other methods of creating or discovering or deriving knowledge. One of those other methods would be logic or rationalism. And so the belief there is that you can come to understand or know things simply through logical thinking and rationalism, rationally deriving some ideas. That's rationalism. Authoritarianism is where you would look at an expert and you would say, well, so-and-so is the expert and they say this, therefore this is true. And so appealing to an expert for your knowledge, that's authoritarianism. Empiricism is appealing to your sensory experience. And what do you see? What do you experience? What do you notice? How does it feel? Those sorts of things are pretty much empiricism. When we look at the scientific method, what we're looking at is a systematic observation. In other words, an observation that would remain true and not just be a result of some other, like maybe you ate something weird for dinner and that's why you had that observation. Therefore, it's really more about what you ate for dinner rather than what you actually observed. And so how do you see it? How do you notice it? How do you experience? That's important in terms of seeing if your observation is systematic. And so science, or the scientific method, is really founded on this ability we have to make observations systematically so that they're reliable, so that we can say, for sure, this is a result of this other thing. You want to be able to verify them by your experience, by observation. It's not about you just sat around and logically derived it. You experienced it, okay? So Locke, John Locke is a philosopher who a little bit more recently compared to like Plato and those boys who really looked at logic. And then there are some critiques of Plato, by skeptical philosophers, right? So John Locke really looked at this idea of you develop what you know through experience. And so the idea is that when you're born, you don't have any knowledge or experience. And then as you gain knowledge and experience, you can come to know things just using that. You don't need to have other influences. You can know everything through the empirical method or through your direct experience. So one interesting question for you to kind of think about, do other people have to also see it and experience it for it to be an empirical knowledge? And we all have internal experiences of things that perhaps we can say, well, I had this experience, therefore I know that X is a true thing. And maybe the person sitting next to you didn't have an experience like that. You know, I certainly know people who call themselves scientists. You can hear I'm a little skeptical, right? They call themselves scientists and they have this belief that if they didn't experience it, it didn't happen. And so to them, everyone has to experience the same exact thing in order for it to be verifiable and scientific. Except the more we know about complicated human beings, we just don't experience things in the same way across the board. And so if I have an experience that this person has never had, they're very comfortable in saying that doesn't exist and assuming that I must be fooled. I don't know. I don't know what the alternative is without making it look like I'm an idiot or, you know, I believe in magic. And so you want to think about this for your own life. What is empiricism? What is truth? What are the methods that you receive truth by? Do other people have to see it and experience it in the same way or at all in order for it to be true, for it to really work as a method? You know, another method of experiencing and truth or coming to a knowledge of truth is revelation. But revelation requires some faith, some kind of assumptions, you know, that also empiricism and rationalism and authoritarianism, all of those things require assumptions and some basic beliefs. And so when it comes right down to it, it's kind of about choosing. You choose. And why would you choose A over B? What is your rationale for choosing A over B, right? So now we've gone way far afield from the field of research methods, although maybe we haven't. But let's move to the next slide in any case, okay? So empiricism is the scientific method for developing knowledge through experience. So it requires that you measure your experience. You have to measure it. You can't just sort of say, well, yeah, I think I had this vague experience and maybe I had it yesterday too, I don't know. You have to measure it so it can be systematic. And the measurement has to be something that is reliable, meaning that you get the same result every time you use that method. And so let's say you're looking at your ruler. Your ruler is a pretty reliable method. When you measure 1 inch one day, it's going to be 1 inch the next day. If it's not 1 inch the next day, you need to get a new ruler, right? Or maybe your roommate got your ruler and shaved some of it off, you know, and they're in the other room laughing at you. I don't know. But a reliable measurement is something that's going to give you the same result every time you measure the same thing with it. A valid measurement, you also need to be valid, is a measure that measures what it says it measures. And so in this case, if your ruler says 1 inch, but let's say your roommate again, who is hilarious, is having fun with you and printed a ruler for you where 1 inch equals actually 1 1/4 inches. And so it's going to measure 1 1/4 inches every day. It's reliable, yes, but it's not valid because 1 1/4 inches is not 1 inch. Make sense? So you need a measure that is both reliable and valid. And that is one of the fun things that make research methods so interesting, is figuring out, how do you measure stuff? How can I measure this idea in a way that other people can agree? Yeah, that's a pretty good measure. That's reliable. That's valid. And it makes sense. And it's doable, okay? So there are different types of measures out in the world, you know, rulers, scales of measurement, et cetera. In psychology and in the research we do in psychology, we're really looking at 3 types of measures. So you have a test or a survey, and this is the measure of what's inside you, essentially. Tell me about your thinking, tell me about your feelings, those sorts of things. We're trying to tap into what's in your brain. We can't directly measure what's in your brain, right? Because those methods are, well, they're not ethical, for one. Also, not accurate, not useful. So you have to kind of ask people what's going on inside you when X happens, or when you see Y, whatever it is. So you can use tests or surveys, and you ask the person to tell them. You can also watch people. Observation, that's where you're looking at people, you're living with people, you're being with people, you're taking notes on people. So observations, a lot of times people call it naturalistic observation. This is used a fair amount in social psychology, where people are hanging out with other people and they're just watching them. I remember when I was in my undergraduate degree, we used to watch kids playing at this little child center, like a school on campus at Brigham Young University. And they would be in this area where they're playing. And here we are seated with our little notebooks and pencils, madly scribbling away, looking at them through one-way mirrors. And so they would have the mirror and we would be sitting behind the mirror, watching them and having basically no idea what we were doing. But every time a kid did something interesting, like get up and throw a block or yell at another kid or lie down and scream and cry and kick their legs, that was very, very awesome for our observations, because then we could write about that instead of write about nothing really happening. And so that was some experience trying to figure out what naturalistic observation was. Other experiments involve people, like say going and living with Native Americans to see what some of their customs were. And so that was very popular in social psychology some time ago. So observation, people that go undercover, like policemen or other kind of agencies that do undercover work, you could see in some ways that's naturalistic observation. You're pretending to be part of the gang. It's a little more dangerous than, your basic sitting behind a one-way mirror, recording how many times Tony throws that block. But it is another method of naturalistic observation where you're gathering information. Okay, and then the last one is physiological. You can measure body responses with physiological methods. So the key here is figuring out exactly what does the body response mean. Sometimes it doesn't mean what we think it means, or sometimes it means more than what we think it means. And so body responses would be something like your heart rate. And so let's say you have a heart rate that is your baseline, and then we introduce some sort of stimulus into the room, like a puppy or a spider, or this bug yesterday that I tried to kill twice and it kept coming back to life and it was really creepy. So my heart rate was, a little different when it came back to life the second time and disappeared. I left the room. And so you could use my heart rate as a measure of me being creeped out, for sure. So some of other examples of physiological methods of measurement other than heart rate one is called galvanic skin response. Galvanic skin response, or GSR, basically measures the amount of sweat that happens in, like, say, your fingertips. Usually your fingertips are used as that measure. And so you put this little machine on, you put a little sensor on fingertips. It's kind of really cool. And then you have the person go through a situation. So one of the things I used to do was measure anxiety in the operating room. So we would look at anxiety with kids. Most of it was around kids, but we'd also look at parents, and some of it we would look at adults. And so one of the things we did in one study was we hooked everyone up to this GSR machine with parents. We didn't hook the kids up to it. And we measured the parents' galvanic skin response as their child was having induction of anesthesia. And you would see this big surge in the amount of sweat that was sensed on fingertips through this machine when the child had induction of anesthesia, as the parents were getting very anxious. So that's another measure. Blood sugar is, it's a measure of blood sugar, but it might also be a measure of particular stress. For example, when you're stressed, cortisol rises in your body, and cortisol can set off blood sugar because, you know, your body needs sugar to fight and to flight. And so you have more blood sugar available when you have cortisol happening, and your body is insulin resistant when cortisol happens. And so blood sugar might be a way of measuring stress. Cortisol level itself might be a way of measuring stress. You can measure your weight. You can measure, I mean, I don't know what height's going to tell you about your psychological profile, and probably not very much. Heart rate variability, that's another really interesting measure. It's becoming more and more studied these days. Heart rate variability is a great measure of your kind of emotional health, or your ability to manage your emotions, or your overall level of stress. And so the higher your heart rate variability is, the better things are with you in terms of stress management. So that's kind of another interesting variable. About heart rate variability, just as a side note, for you to see this interesting theme, I'm going to try and point it out to you here and there, is heart rate variability was discovered by Stephen Porges. And he was originally looking at infants and found that there was some variability in heart rate. And the people around him basically said, no, you can't measure. Obviously, you're a terrible scientist. And so that was their reaction to this new discovery. And it is that kind of reaction that happens all through science for centuries and centuries and centuries. People discover things that make other people question what they know about the world. And most of the people react and say, you're wrong, go away. And so this happened with heart rate variability decades ago. Now it is a thing. It's very cool. Observation examples, you can count how many times something happens. Like we talked about, how many times does Tony throw the block when you're observing behind the one-way mirror. A lot of times you will code a behavior. You will watch for behaviors, and you have some sort of coding scheme that will help you reliably and with validity record what's happening. And so if Tony throws a block, a couple feet, that might be coded as block throwing 1. And if Tony throws a block and it lands 10 feet away, then you might code that as block throwing 3, etc. Or you might look at an expression on a face and code it. Is it fine? Is it happy? Is it sad? What is it? Now, in order to code things, of course, you have to be trained in your coding. So everybody's coding things the same way. If people aren't trained and then they're coding it all the way that they think works, then of course their answers probably won't agree, and you won't have a very reliable measure. So coding behavior is a method people use when they're using observation. Psychological measures, of course, those are all kinds of questionnaires, tests, surveys. You kind of use the same word. I mean, lots of different words to look at the same idea. And so you can say, well, I took this test, or I took this survey, or I took this questionnaire. Pretty much means the same exact thing. An anxiety survey, an anxiety test, an anxiety questionnaire, all the same thing, just so that doesn't confuse you as we start going through some more specific examples of questionnaires. All right, next thing I want to talk about is this idea of your methods driving the research. So when I say driving the research, I mean that the methods are the thing that kind of sparks the kind of research that happens. The methods are the thing that sparks what research occurs. The type of research you do is often a result of the kinds of methods you can use. And so let's say you're in this class, which you are, and you hear about galvanic skin response. You're like, wow, that's really cool. I want to do something with that because that's just so cool. And so you design a study because you think galvanic skin response is cool. Now that's an example of your method driving your research, as opposed to sitting around and thinking about what research should we do. how do we need to contribute to this body of knowledge? What are some things that are missing? Okay, so then you identify something that's missing, and then you figure out how do you best measure the thing that's missing. And so there, what's driving it is your investigation into the body of knowledge. The research is driving the method instead of the method driving the research. There's nothing morally wrong about methods driving research, but I just want you to notice that, you know, a lot of times research is a result of a method and not a result of exploring a body of knowledge in a systematic manner. So if you did it in a systematic way, there would be like researchers all over the world cooperating and having these like big, huge mega meetings and saying, what do we know about X? What do we need to know? Okay, Brown and Allen, you do that. Okay, you know, you two over here, you do that. This group over here, you do that. And then we'll get together in 10 years and see where we are and what needs to happen. And that doesn't work. I mean, that's not the way it happens. Wouldn't it be nice? People try to do things like that. They try to get together in groups and systematically approach. And there are definitely attempts to do that. But a lot of times what happens is you have something come up, like COVID is a great example. Something happens and there's a lot of interest in that, and then there's a lot of money. And the money will drive the research. And so it's like, well, there's money to study X. Maybe I'm not really interested in X, but I sure want a grant. So let me apply for this grant to study X. And so then I'll come up with some study idea that will get me money. And so the research is driven by the money. The research might be driven by the person who you're working with. You know, if you work with an expert in a particular area, you're probably going to do research in their area, which is fine. When you're learning how to do research, it's actually a really great thing. But in the end, you know, you can develop this expertise in an area that doesn't really need a ton more research done in it. And then again, something else is driving the research other than some sort of systematic exploration of what's out there. So type of research you do, often a result of the type of method that you want to use. And also knowing that empiricism isn't perfect in terms of the way of getting knowledge. People treat empiricism as if it's the be-all, end-all, final answer. And so they'll say, well, a study showed that that doesn't work. And they think like, well, the end, you know, it's like hard period there. Just boom, put that period on the end of the sentence, and that's correct. This study doesn't support this. Blammo. And that's not really always the case. You can have a bunch of studies that all come to a similar conclusion, and you can be pretty certain that conclusion is probably correct, but there may be something you don't know. There might be something out there that explains it in a different way where you are not doing it in a systematic way. You've left out a variable and you don't even know you've left out a variable. And this also happens in science. So this is a little bit of philosophy of science here, and I just want you to learn how to question empirical findings without swallowing them in whole and thinking that means final truth has been achieved. So let's move on to this next section, which is ideas and measures. So this is where we're going to start out in terms of you building your research proposal. So you're going to do 2 research proposals this semester. I'm going to make one of them fairly simple, and then so you can have a practice, and then the next one can be more your big thing. I think this will be much better for you, serving you much better in terms of helping you learn it in a way that's less stressful and easier. I know it might seem worse to have 2 instead of 1. I think it's going to be better. You're going to do them with me throughout the week, and so it's not going to be a few weeks of you wringing your hands and tearing out your hair. We'll just kind of work along through the weeks with those ideas, and then you'll just build a proposal that way. So the first thing you're going to start with, you know, week 1, let's just jump right in, right? The first thing I want you to do is come up with a few research questions. Now, you may find this difficult because maybe all through high school, you never got a chance to wonder. You never got a chance to ask questions Your primary worry was, well, what's the correct question? I mean, correct answer. You're very focused on giving the correct answers. And here in university, we're not going to do that. Here, your job is to wonder, it's to question, it's to learn how to think critically. And so I want you to come up with ideas. What are some things that you are interested in, that you find curious? And now that may be, again, hard to do. And so let's try it with a method-driven or measure-driven approach, because I think then you can start getting in the habit of asking questions. And so in your assignment for the week that you don't have it yet, but it's next after you take the quiz, you can pull this up. Your assignment is look at this list of measures. So I'm giving you a whole list of a bunch of measures, and you can read through those and see if any measures look really interesting to you and spark ideas. And so let's say you have a measure of depression. Here's your measure of depression, and you think, okay, well, I'm kind of interested in depression, you know, and do I have any questions? What do I wonder about depression? You might wonder about the rate of depression in a particular population. Let's say nursing homes. What's the rate of depression in nursing homes? Or what's the rate of depression in faculty versus administration? Is there a difference? That sort of a thing. So think about, what are you curious about? Start having some ideas get sparked for you. Here's another example. What could you measure if you're using the method of heart rate? Could you measure exercise effectiveness? How many SVU students can get their heart rate up to sustained at 150? How many kind of flop out before then? How many people's heart rate goes up too high and they have to stop, etc. You could measure exercise effectiveness. You could measure anxiety with heart rate. You might have some questions about anxiety. You know, what's the average heart rate of a person who is in the cafeteria versus a person who is in the academic center, that sort of a thing. You could measure calm, you know, if you have a lower heart rate. We could assume that means you're calmer. It might also mean that you can run a 4-minute mile and you're all good there. What else could you measure with heart rate? Just kind of think about some things. Remember here, the purpose of the research proposal is to learn how to write a research proposal. So I very, very much encourage you to not think that this is the time of your life where you are going to create the perfect proposal to answer the burning question you have about something that's fairly obscure. It's probably not a good time for that, because the main idea here is you learn how to do it, not that you accomplish your dream. I give the same kind of advice to people who are writing their dissertation. The purpose of writing a dissertation is to learn how to do it. It's not to do your life work. Wait until after you get your dissertation done. Then you can start your life work. Then you can get into the stuff that you're really interested in. The dissertation, look at what can I get done in a year? What can I actually finish? I'll do that, because it's really about learning how to do a study, not about your heart in your study. Same thing here, okay? What could you measure with observing people? So when I was at Yale again, like I said, we were looking at measuring anxiety in children, anxiety in parents. There was a measure called the campus. The campus was developed by a guy named Ron Blunt, who's at University of Georgia. Brilliant instrument, and it was a way of coding video to determine anxiety. And so you would look at the video and you had all these coding rules that you learned. And it took some time to get trained into this so that you could code accurately, so that you could code reliably. And so I thought, let's apply the campus to the perioperative environment. And so with the help of Ron Blunt, we did that. We applied the campus to the perioperative environment and came up with an instrument that we called the P-Campus, the perioperative campus, right? And so we used the P-Campus to measure parent and child interactions to see if we could predict anxiety through those interactions. People were trained, our research assistants were trained in that method enough so that they achieved really good reliability with each other. And so we knew that they were all measuring the same things. And then we could see if particular parent interactions increased or decreased anxiety. And that was pretty cool. One of the things that we found increased anxiety was parents who kept calling attention to the kids' anxiety. You know, if you're like, wow, you're really so anxious, can you just stop being anxious? You know, that definitely made kids more anxious. And distracting the kid, like, hey, let's look at this book. Hey, let's, you know, that really helps the kids calm down. So what could you measure with a questionnaire or an observation? You know, mood questionnaire, personality questionnaire. In this list that you'll see in your later assignment this week, you will find a ton of different questionnaires and ideas. And that should spark something in you. Okay, last idea here, kind of the last idea, is what is a construct? So we're going to use this word throughout the semester, and you'll start to hear it in university, hopefully in other classes as well. A construct is simply another word for idea or concept. So he came up with this construct, or he came up with this concept or this idea. A construct is the idea. So for example, the idea of depression, that is a construct. Anxiety is a construct. Personality is a construct. Flexibility is a construct, okay? So to measure depression, what you need is something that will measure that construct. And so like we'd said earlier, you need a reliable and a valid scale when you're testing depression. And so remember, reliable means that it measures the same thing every time. You remember, like that ruler that always measures an inch. And valid means that it measures what it says it measures. And so your ruler's inch is an actual inch on every other ruler, right? That's what valid means. And so a valid and reliable test for depression would be a test that would give you the same result every time you put those kind of a similarly depressed person onto the test. So let's say you get a bunch of people who are really, really depressed, and they all take this depression test. They all come out looking really depressed. Then you say, okay, well, this is reliable. If half of them come out looking happy and you know that they're depressed, then it's not valid, and it's also not reliable. Okay, more constructs. We talked about some of them. You know, feelings, personality, pathology, like amount of psychosis, attitudes, parenting practices, anything that you want to measure, what we would call a construct. All right, so with this research proposal that you're going to create, and you practice and then you do it again, even better the second time, you're going to think of what you want to measure, what do you want to find out about. You work on it with me each week, so it's not going to be a big stressful deal. And then you put it together in a proposal, and then we'll do it again. When you decide what you want to look at, what construct you want to focus on in your research, then you decide how do you measure that construct. And so the measurement of the construct, in other words, like if my construct is depression, and I decide that the way I want to measure my construct is using the Beck Depression Inventory, the BDI. That construct being measured by the BDI, that's called the operational definition. And so the operational definition of your construct is how you're measuring it. Let me say it one more time, because this is really critical that you figure this out and you remember it. The definition, the operational definition of your construct is how you're measuring your construct. So if my construct's depression, my operational definition of depression is the Beck Depression Inventory. If my construct is need for play, then my operational definition of that construct is the scale that measures need for play on the Personality Research Forum, for example. My need for affiliation, if that's what I want to measure, that's the construct, my need for affiliation. My operational definition of need for affiliation is the scale that measures need for affiliation on the Personality Research Forum. If my construct is what is my child's anxiety during anesthesia induction, I can measure it with a scale called the YPAS, the Modified Yale Preoperative Anxiety Scale. Or I can measure the construct of parent-child interactions that are anxious, anxiety-provoking. I can measure that with the P-Campus. So the operational definition is the measure you're using. It's the test you're using, the questionnaire that you're using, the physiological measure. You know, heart rate can be the can be a operational definition of the construct of anxiety. So if you say, I want to measure anxiety, how are we going to define it? We're going to define anxiety as a heart rate that is over 120. Let's say we did that. That would be my operational definition of anxiety. Heart rate over 120, operational definition. So let's review what we've learned. We talked about empiricism. Empiricism is knowledge that you get through your experience. It's not knowledge you get from other people. It's not knowledge that you get from logic. It's knowledge that you get directly through experiencing the world, observing, feeling, etc. The scientific method is a method of systematic observations. You're using systematic observations where you're not just willy-nilly kind of writing down whatever occurs to you. It's systematic. It's organized. A construct is a construct is an idea or a concept. An operational definition is what you're using to measure that construct. It's the measure of the construct, the operational definition. And then there's three basic ways that you measure things. You can either observe, or you can give people questionnaires, tests, surveys, etc. Or you can use physiological measures of things that happen in their body. Okay, so that's your review for today's pre-recorded lecture. So your next step, if you haven't already read the chapter, read the chapter. Next step is take the quiz. You don't have to wait till the deadline to take the quiz. You can take the quiz anytime. Next, after the quiz, do the developmental interaction assignment for this week. This is all for you in pages. It's all listed on the pages. And so you can just go to the page for this week and all of this stuff will be there. You don't have to try and go find it anywhere else. So when you do this developmental interaction assignment, you'll turn it in, I will comment on it, and then you need to respond to my comments. And you need to make your response by the response due date and see the syllabus for that depending on what group you're in. And then the final end of this whole first chapter idea is that you come to class and we apply what you've learned so far. And so here, instead of the typical method, which is you come to class, you kind of learn about the chapter, maybe I introduced the chapter, maybe you were supposed to read the chapter, but you didn't, whatever. And then you go home and you're like, okay, well, I think I kind of got it, the end. Or you're like, okay, well, I got to read that chapter because I have a test, you know, in 2 weeks. So then your learning just isn't really that great with that kind of approach. And so this way, you're doing a lot of basic learning, developing that learning, and then capping it off with applying the learning. So then you'll really get that learning much more. So come to class. We will apply what you've learned so far next week. Great. Lovely. I will see you then.